Chapter 1. The Crash Landing. The stars stretched out across the infinite blackness like ancient, distant beacons, illuminating the deep expanse of space as if they were waiting to guide her. Zyra, a small, delicate creature from the far-off world of Seraphis, stared out of the cracked viewport, her tiny frame barely fitting into the command chair of the small, sleek craft she had been piloting. The ship, designed for exploration and long-range travel, had once been her pride, an unyielding vessel capable of reaching the furthest corners of the galaxy, a ship that could traverse hostile atmospheres and survive the most brutal conditions. Yet now, it felt like a fragile thing, barely holding together as the emergency lights flashed in warning, the hull groaning under the stress of the failing engine, and a strange tremor in the air suggesting that the end was near. The craft had been built for speed, for elegance, but it had never been meant for the terror of uncontrolled descent. Her hands, small and nimble from years of training, gripped the control panel with a firmness that didn't match the sinking feeling in her chest. The sudden jolt she had felt earlier when the rogue asteroid had struck the ship had shaken her to her core. The impact had been nothing short of catastrophic. The ship's hull was intact, but the damage had crippled the engine, rendering her helpless as the once pristine craft careened toward an unknown world at an ever-accelerating speed. There had been no time to send a distress signal, no way to call for help. All she could do was hold on and pray that somehow, someway, she would survive this, and that her people would one day know that she had made it to this distant, uncharted world, if only to gather the necessary information. But no matter how many times she told herself that she would survive this, a darker, deeper part of her felt certain that this would be the end. The planet below her, a swirling orb of green and blue, had appeared so welcoming from space, so calm and serene. Now, with each passing second, it seemed like a vast, uncaring ocean. It would take everything she had just to make it to the surface, and even then, she didn't know if it would be enough to save her. She could feel the atmosphere growing thicker as her ship barreled through the lower stratosphere, the once controlled flight now entirely out of her hands. Her ship was plummeting, and despite every attempt to regain control, all she could do was close her eyes and brace for the inevitable. Her alien species, Seraphis, were known throughout the galaxy for their resilience. Their fragile, slender bodies were a stark contrast to the unyielding force of their will. They were small, barely taller than a human child, their translucent skin a soft shade of lavender, their bright eyes adapted to the dimmer conditions of their homeworld. They were gentle beings, peaceful and curious by nature, but their instincts for survival were sharp, honed over generations of navigating the harshest corners of the universe. As a child, Zyra had been taught to handle a wide variety of technologies, to chart stars, and to pilot ships. Yet, nothing could have prepared her for this. Nothing could have prepared her for the overwhelming sense of helplessness that had taken over her mind as the ship continued to plunge downward, the instruments flickering and failing with each passing moment. The worst part wasn't the crash. She had been trained for that, to some extent. It wasn't the descent, the endless stretch of open space that now swallowed the small craft whole. No, the worst part was that she couldn't see it coming. There was no way to know how bad the damage truly was, how fast the descent was accelerating, or if she even had enough time to do anything before it was too late. As a scientist, she was accustomed to the unknown, but as a pilot, she had always had control. This was different. Her life had always been in her hands, but now, it seemed like there was nothing she could do to change the inevitable. Seconds stretched into minutes, and as the ground grew nearer, Zyra's thoughts began to race. There was a strange calmness to her thoughts now, like she was almost removed from the situation, floating in a separate realm as the laws of physics continued to press her down. She could hear the pounding of her heart in her ears, the rhythmic pulse of panic, but even that faded as she focused on the world below. The world she had been tasked with exploring. The world that would, in all likelihood, be the final resting place of her ship and herself. The first real hint of danger came when the ship began to shake violently. A low rumble reverberated through the vessel's frame, and Zyra's small body was thrown against the safety harness, the tension in the straps cutting into her delicate frame. She gritted her teeth as her hands instinctively gripped the console harder. It was a futile gesture, of course. The ship was beyond saving, but she couldn't help herself. In her desperation, her instincts kicked in, her mind running through every possible scenario in the blink of an eye. Could she eject? Was it too late for that? Should she try to pull the emergency chute? Was there even a chance that she could survive? The chances were slim, but still, she couldn't just sit there, waiting for the end. She flicked a switch, attempting to activate the emergency chute, but the console sparked and fizzled, the system's dead and useless. She cursed under her breath. If only she had a few more moments, a few more seconds, she might have been able to think of something else. But the ground was rushing up faster now, the air pressure increasing, the noise of wind outside growing deafening. And then, with a gut-wrenching jolt, the ship's descent came to a sudden, heart-stopping halt. The craft crashed into the rocky surface of the planet below with a bone-shaking thud. A wave of pain flooded through her as her body was thrown forward, her head slamming against the controls, knocking her unconscious before she even had time to realize what had happened. When she came to, the first thing she felt was the aching throb in her head, the taste of metallic blood in her mouth. Her eyes fluttered open, her vision blurry, and she tried to push herself upright, but her body wouldn't respond. She was disoriented, her thoughts swirling like a whirlwind. The ship had crashed, that much was clear. But what was less clear was whether or not she had made it. The cockpit was dark, the instruments dead and blackened, and the air was heavy with the scent of burning fuel. She could hear nothing except for her own ragged breathing. The world outside seemed strangely still, eerily silent compared to the chaos of the crash. There were no alarms blaring, no fires consuming the remains of the ship. Only the silence of an unknown planet filled her ears. She staggered to her feet, forcing herself to remain calm, using every ounce of her Seraphist training to keep her head clear. She stumbled forward, her head still spinning as she pulled herself to the hatch. She had to get out, had to know where she was. She couldn't stay here. There was no way to know how long the ship would remain intact or if it would collapse entirely. The sooner she left, the better. With a forceful push, she managed to pry the hatch open, a gust of fresh, cool air rushing into the cabin, mixing with the smell of the ship's burning wreckage. She took a deep breath, feeling a slight sense of relief, and then, with a final heave, the hatch clicked open fully. The planet's sky greeted her vast, empty, and dotted with a few distant stars. Zyra stepped out of the wreckage and onto the alien soil. Her legs wobbled beneath her as she gazed around at the strange landscape. The planet was a mixture of rocky terrain, arid deserts, and jagged mountains in the distance. It was beautiful in its own way, but there was something ominous about it. And then, in the distance, she saw movement. Something large, something dangerous. It was difficult to make out the shape, but Zyra's heart skipped a beat as she realized that someone was coming toward her. Panic surged in her chest. She had no weapons, no way of defending herself. All she could do was watch as the silhouette grew closer. Was it another predator? Was it the local life form of this hostile world? Or was it something worse, something far beyond her comprehension? The figure emerged from the mist, and Zyra froze, her heart racing as it revealed itself to be a human. A tall, muscular man with short-cropped dark hair, wearing some sort of armor. His gaze immediately locked onto her, his eyes widening with surprise. Zyra's mind raced. There was no way she could communicate with him, no way to explain her presence here. Her instincts screamed at her to run, to escape. She had heard stories about humans. They were known for their merciless nature, ruthless in their pursuit of resources. Her people had long considered humans to be predatory, war-driven creatures. What was this one doing here, on a planet far from any known human colonies? And then, with shocking clarity, she realized the truth. He would eat her. Her worst fear was coming true. The tiny alien girl was certain the human would devour her, break her into pieces, and consume her, as so many of her people had feared for centuries. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. As the man stepped closer, Zyra's heart pounded louder in her chest, her pulse quickening. Would he strike now? Or would he show mercy? The human, now standing only a few meters away, seemed to take in her fragile form, his eyes scanning her from head to toe. His gaze was not one of hunger or malice, though she was certain she should be nothing more than food to him, a delicate little creature from an alien world with no power to defend herself. Her species had long feared humans. Legends and rumors passed down through the stars about their violent, often merciless ways. Every encounter with them, at least those documented, had been a brutal one. Whether driven by desperation or greed, humans had been known to destroy worlds, conquer planets, and wipe out entire species in the name of their expansion. To think that she might have been the next in line to be consumed was something that chilled her to the bone, though she couldn't fathom how exactly. The air between them crackled with tension, but to her surprise, the man didn't lunge forward. He didn't raise a weapon, nor did he take a threatening stance. His eyes, though filled with the confusion and intensity of the moment, softened slightly, as if trying to understand the sight before him. A small alien girl, standing at his feet like some fragile, exotic flower of a world so far removed from his own. Zyra took a small step backward, her legs shaky from the crash and from the sheer terror gripping her. Her breathing quickened. She was trapped. There was no way she could run, and there was no place to hide. She had no weapons, no means of defense, and this human before her. She feared what he might do. "Hey, are you okay?" The human's voice was not harsh but soft, almost cautious, as though unsure how to approach her. It was the last thing she had expected. He sounded concerned. The human's hand was outstretched, palm up, an unspoken gesture of peace, an invitation to trust. But Zyra's instincts told her that this was nothing but a trick, a predator luring its prey into a false sense of security. She backed away a little further, her heart pounding faster. She needed to think, needed to act, but fear had taken root, clouding her judgment. Her eyes flicked to the wreckage of her ship, but she knew there was no escape from it. Even if she could reach it, it was useless now, a crumpled heap of metal and circuitry. She was stranded, with no idea how to communicate or what this human would do to her. "Please, I won't hurt you," he said, his voice steady but warm, trying to close the distance between them. I don't know what you are. What are you?" She swallowed hard, the words forming in her throat, but she couldn't bring herself to speak. What would she even say? Would he understand her language? Was it even worth trying? Maybe if she tried to speak, it would only make him more suspicious. Perhaps it would be the signal for him to strike. Her mind raced, desperately trying to find a way out of the situation. The human stepped closer again, slower this time, his expression still filled with curiosity but no sign of violence. He crouched down slightly, as though to appear less intimidating, his eyes locking onto hers with a gaze that seemed almost empathetic. Was this a trap? Was he trying to lower her guard to make it easier to capture her? "Look, I don't mean to frighten you," he said. "I just need to know that you're not Dash." Before he could finish his sentence, Zyra reacted on instinct. She spun quickly, moving with surprising speed despite her exhaustion, and bolted in the opposite direction, her feet stumbling over the rocky terrain as she desperately tried to find some kind of cover. But the planet offered her no sanctuary. The earth beneath her was dry and uneven, littered with jagged stones that scraped against her feet and hindered her every movement. Behind her, she could hear the human's footsteps, heavy, purposeful, chasing after her, but not at the speed she feared. The man wasn't running to catch her, just following her at a steady pace, a few meters behind. She felt the adrenaline spike again, the fear of being hunted rising in her chest like a suffocating wave, and yet, something else gnawed at her as she ran. The human wasn't chasing her with the savage urgency she had anticipated. It was almost as if he was giving her space to flee, waiting for her to turn around. She didn't know what to make of it. Was it a trick, or had her assumptions about humans been completely wrong? Zyra stumbled and fell to her knees, her small body exhausted from the crash, her arms trembling from the effort of running. But still, she forced herself to push onward. She could see no other way but to keep going. There had to be something. The human wasn't chasing with the vicious intent she had imagined, wasn't closing in for the kill. It only added to the confusion. She had no idea how long she ran, perhaps minutes, perhaps hours, but eventually, the landscape around her began to shift. She was no longer surrounded by jagged rocks and barren ground. Instead, she found herself at the edge of a dense forest, thick trees rising up on either side, their leaves glowing faintly in the muted light. The sight of shelter, of some place where she could hide or at least gather her bearings, gave her a brief surge of hope. Maybe she could lose the human here. Maybe, just maybe, this was the chance she had been waiting for. She could rest, recover, and figure out what to do next. Just as she thought she might make it to the tree line, a voice called out to her. "Hey, wait. I'm not going to hurt you." The man's voice was distant, yet somehow still carrying a sense of urgency. "Please, I'm just trying to help. I know you're scared. I am too." Zyra froze in place, her back stiffening at the sound of the human's words. She had no idea how he could possibly be scared. He was a human, capable of destruction and violence. Yet here he was, pleading with her not to run. It didn't make sense. Nothing made sense. She had assumed the worst about him, as she had been taught by the ancient stories of her people, the tales of humans who would devour her kind, tear apart alien races for sport or food. She could hear her ancestors' voices in her head, warning her against trusting any human, warning her to flee at the first sign of danger. Yet here was a human, not only not attacking her, but trying to reason with her. She stood still for a moment, her heart racing, before she slowly turned around. He hadn't come closer. He was standing at the edge of the open field, watching her cautiously but without any weapon in hand. He stood with his hands raised slightly, in an open gesture, as if to assure her that he posed no threat. "I'm not going to hurt you," he repeated, his voice softer now. "I promise." Zyra could hardly believe what she was hearing. Her mind still screamed at her to flee, to run and hide, to protect herself from this strange, unpredictable predator, but something within her, something deep and primal, made her hesitate. She still didn't know if she could trust him, but she had seen no aggression from him thus far. If anything, he seemed more bewildered by the encounter than anything else. Was he truly different from the stories she had heard? Was he truly kind? With a deep breath, Zyra slowly took a tentative step forward, her body tense but controlled, watching him carefully. She knew she had no choice. She couldn't keep running forever, and she couldn't remain in the open for too long. The human's presence still unsettled her, but her instincts, her intuition, were slowly shifting. She had been wrong about him in so many ways, and perhaps, just perhaps, she had underestimated the situation. Maybe fate had other plans for her. She was about to speak when a rumbling noise suddenly vibrated through the ground beneath her feet. Her head snapped up, eyes widening in alarm as she realized that something much larger than herself was emerging from the forest. Something far more dangerous. Chapter 2. The Hidden Threat. The earth trembled beneath Zyra's feet as she heard the deep growl coming from the trees. Her instincts screamed at her to run, to flee into the dense forest where she might find some cover or shelter. The human turned toward the noise, his body tensing as he stood beside her. The ground shook again, and she could feel it beneath her skin, a primal force that echoed through the trees, as though the very planet itself was alive with danger. "Stay close to me," the human said, his voice low but urgent. Before Zyra could react, the source of the rumbling emerged from the undergrowth, and her heart froze in her chest. A massive creature, towering above her, stepped out of the trees. Its scales shimmered in the light, and its eyes glowed with an otherworldly intelligence. The beast was like nothing Zyra had ever seen before. It was part insect, part mammal, its long, sinewy limbs ending in vicious claws, and its jagged teeth were bared in a low growl. Its sheer size made it a terrifying sight. She had seen creatures like this before on her homeworld's wildlife databanks, but only in stories. This was the stuff of nightmares. She instinctively took a step back, her body trembling with fear as the beast locked its eyes onto her. But the human didn't flinch. He took a step forward, his hand reaching for the weapon strapped to his side. Zyra's heart raced. Was this the moment where he would fight the creature? Was he willing to protect her, even if it meant risking his life? But to her shock, he didn't draw the weapon. Instead, he stood between her and the creature, his body tense and still, as though trying to assess the situation. "Stay back," he said, his voice strong and firm. "I don't want to hurt you, but I will if I have to." The creature stopped, its eyes narrowing as it sized them both up. For a moment, the three of them stood in a tense standoff, alien, human, and predator, each sizing up the other in silence. It was clear that the creature didn't view the human as an immediate threat, but it was still a wild animal, driven by instincts that were older than the stars themselves. And for Zyra, it was clear that her survival and the humans depended on what would happen next. The creature before them, its immense form shifting slightly with the wind, seemed to tower over both Zyra and the human. Its muscular legs, thick with sinew, flexed in a menacing manner, and the sharp claws at the tips of its feet dug into the earth, sending small tremors through the ground. Its eyes, glowing with a yellowish light, locked onto Zyra, the small, alien girl whose race had never before encountered such a beast, nor such a scenario. She could feel the raw primal energy radiating from it, a beast that lived by its instincts, a predator that survived by tearing through its environment with vicious efficiency. She wasn't sure if it could even comprehend the idea of compassion or mercy. But what truly unnerved her was that this was not the same fear she had felt when she first saw the human. This was something else entirely. The beast was beyond anything she had encountered in all her years as an explorer. It was wild, untamed, and its hunger seemed to fill the air, thick with an almost palpable hunger. And it was focused on her. Her heart pounded fiercely in her chest, and she instinctively wanted to flee, to run, to find shelter, but she knew she had nowhere to go. The human's presence beside her, though a momentary relief, did not fill her with the same overwhelming sense of safety. His presence only added more questions to the confusion already churning in her mind. The human, whose name she didn't even know, was still standing there in front of her, not retreating, but facing the creature with a calmness that she couldn't understand. There was no panic in his eyes, no hesitation. The creature, despite its terrifying size, was not attacking, not yet. It was as though it, too, was sizing them up, trying to determine whether they were worth its effort or if it should retreat and find easier prey elsewhere. Zyra couldn't help but wonder how the human had come to possess such courage, how he could face the very thing that had kept her frozen in terror for so long. He stood, unmoving, his feet planted firmly on the ground, his body tense but ready. "Please," the human said, his voice firm but filled with the kind of command that came from years of experience. "We don't want to fight. We're not your enemy." Zyra's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the human, and then back at the creature, her mind spinning. What could the human possibly hope to achieve with such a statement? Was it possible that this creature, this wild beast, understood words? The tension in the air was unbearable, thick with uncertainty. The ground beneath her feet was shaky, unstable, as if the very planet had sensed the impending struggle. For a long moment, the creature did not move, its eyes still locked onto the pair in front of it. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it lowered its head slightly, its sharp snout inching closer to the ground, its nostrils flaring as it sniffed the air around them. Zyra watched in awe and horror as the creature took a cautious step forward, its massive body moving with unnerving grace despite its sheer size. But still, the human didn't flinch. His voice broke through the stillness once more, quieter this time, but no less firm. "It's okay. Stay calm." The creature's gaze never wavered, but its action slowed, its stance relaxing just a fraction. Zyra could hardly believe her eyes. Was it truly listening to him? How could a creature like that wild, untamed understand anything the human said? Was it just testing them? Or was it something more? The tension between them seemed to stretch on for an eternity, but it was the creature that made the first real move. Slowly, it began to back away, its glowing eyes never leaving them, its movements hesitant but deliberate. It wasn't retreating, not completely, but it was no longer advancing with the kind of deadly intent it had displayed moments earlier. It was as though it had been momentarily pacified, as if the human's presence was enough to prevent the attack. Zyra stood in stunned silence, her heart still racing in her chest. She could hardly process what had just happened. The beast, a creature that she had been certain would tear her apart, had been what? Dissuaded by words alone? Was it possible that the human had somehow communicated with it, reached some unspoken understanding? The creature's glowing eyes flickered once more, and without another sound, it turned, its massive body moving away, disappearing into the thick underbrush of the forest. It was gone, just like that, leaving behind only the strange echo of its growl and the remnants of its primal presence in the air. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, Zyra felt her legs buckle beneath her. She sank to her knees, her body trembling from the adrenaline that had coursed through her during those tense moments. The world around her seemed to tilt, her breath coming in short gasps as she struggled to comprehend what had just happened. She had been certain she would die there, that the creature would devour her with its immense jaws, but instead, it had been held back by the very thing she had feared most, a human. She turned to look at the man, who was still standing tall, watching the forest where the creature had disappeared. There was no sign of triumph on his face, no expression of victory. He simply exhaled slowly, as if releasing a breath he had been holding in for far too long. Then, as if sensing her gaze, he looked down at her, his expression calm, yet tinged with something else, something deeper. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low and steady. Zyra nodded, but her mind was still reeling. "How did you do that?" she managed to ask, her voice shaky. The man's eyes softened slightly, and he gave a slight, rueful smile. I don't really know. I guess I just didn't want to die today. For the first time, Zyra found herself laughing, though it was a small, uncertain sound. The tension that had weighed on her shoulders was slowly beginning to lift. She had survived. Against all odds, she had made it through this moment. And perhaps, for the first time since crashing on this alien planet, she wasn't entirely alone. But as the human reached out a hand to help her to her feet, Zyra felt something stir deep inside her, something more than just the relief of survival. She was beginning to realize that fate, cruel and unpredictable as it had been, had different plans for her. She had feared the human, had believed him to be nothing more than a predator. Yet, here he was, standing beside her, offering his help, not as a hunter, but as an ally. She hesitated for just a moment, uncertain of what the future held. But then, she took his hand. I'm Zyra, she said softly, her voice tentative but growing stronger with each word. The man nodded, his grip firm and steady. Name's Ethan, he replied. I don't know why I'm here, but it looks like we've got a lot of figuring out to do. Zyra nodded in agreement. Though she couldn't shake the feeling that their encounter, their shared survival, was only the beginning of something much bigger. The world around them, with all its dangers and mysteries, was still unknown, but now, for the first time, she didn't feel entirely helpless. Chapter 3, Strange Alliances. The forest was quieter now, the ominous growl of the predator fading into the distance, leaving only the rustling of leaves in the wake of its departure. Zyra and Ethan stood together in the clearing, their breathing finally starting to slow, their minds still reeling from the encounter. Despite the confusion of the situation, a strange sense of camaraderie had begun to form between them, something unspoken but undeniable. They were both survivors, both stranded on an alien planet, both thrown into a situation neither had planned for, and yet here they were, standing side by side, as unlikely allies. Zyra looked around the forest, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings with wary eyes. The trees here were unlike anything she had seen before, their trunks wide and gnarled, their leaves shimmering with an iridescent glow that illuminated the forest floor. The air was thick with the scent of earth and damp foliage, and the ground beneath her feet was soft, as if the entire forest was alive in its own way. The planet was beautiful, in a way dangerous, yes, but beautiful all the same. And yet, as she looked around, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. There was something about this place that felt wrong, like there were eyes hidden in the shadows, watching, waiting. We need to move, Ethan said suddenly, breaking her reverie. This place is too exposed. That creature wasn't the only thing out there, and it won't be long before others show up. Zyra nodded, pulling herself together as she focused on the human's words. She had no idea what dangers lurked in this strange world, but Ethan seemed to know. He had acted without hesitation when the creature had appeared, and now, his instincts were leading them forward. It was hard to admit, but she found herself trusting him. She wasn't sure why, but she knew that survival meant sticking together. Lead the way, Zyra said, her voice more composed now. Ethan glanced at her, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. This way, we'll find shelter. And maybe, just maybe, some answers. As they moved deeper into the forest, Zyra couldn't help but wonder about their future. She had no idea what had brought this human here, but one thing was clear. The fate of this planet, and possibly their own, was now inextricably tied together. The universe, in all its complexity, had thrown them together, and now, it was up to them to figure out what came next. As Zyra and Ethan ventured deeper into the forest, the dense canopy above them seemed to close in, the glowing leaves of the alien trees casting an eerie light on the path ahead. The air grew thicker with humidity, and the ground beneath their feet was soft and spongy, a mixture of damp soil and strange, bioluminescent fungi that glowed faintly underfoot. The forest was alive, in ways that Zyra couldn't fully comprehend. The rustling of unseen creatures and the distant calls of birds, if they could even be called birds, echoed through the trees, creating a symphony of alien sounds that filled the air. Despite the growing beauty of the forest around her, Zyra felt a gnawing sense of unease. Every step she took felt like it was drawing her deeper into the unknown. She had been an explorer for most of her life, but this was different. This planet felt foreign in a way that no other world had. It wasn't just the physical terrain, Though it was unlike anything she had encountered before, it was the overwhelming sense that the planet itself was alive with its own secrets. It was as if the forest was watching them, observing their every move. The trees seemed to shift in the corner of her vision, and the distant hum of strange life forms only heightened the feeling that they weren't alone. But it wasn't just the environment that made her feel unsettled. It was Ethan. Despite the calm exterior he presented, there was something about him that seemed different. He was human, yes, but the way he moved, the way he had acted during the encounter with the predator, suggested a kind of quiet strength, a survival instinct that she couldn't quite understand. She had feared him at first, thinking he would be just another dangerous predator in this strange world. But now, after everything, she wasn't sure where he stood. He had helped her, he had saved her from the creature, but what did he want in return? Was he truly an ally, or was there some hidden agenda beneath his calm demeanor? How did you know what to do with that creature? Zyra asked, breaking the silence that had settled between them as they continued their trek. Her voice was cautious, the question one that had been simmering in her mind since the moment the predator had backed off. Ethan didn't look at her immediately, but instead, his eyes remained fixed on the path ahead, scanning the trees and underbrush. He was always vigilant, always alert, like a predator himself though. In this moment, he was the protector. I've had my fair share of encounters with dangerous creatures, he said, his voice low but steady. The key is not to panic. They can smell fear, you know. He paused for a moment, then added, almost as an afterthought, and knowing when to stand your ground, when to show no weakness. Zyra absorbed his words, trying to make sense of them. The way he spoke, the calmness in his tone, seemed to indicate that he had faced similar situations before. She had heard stories of humans in her people's archives, legends of their strength, their ingenuity, their capacity for violence. She had heard of the wars they had waged, the battles they had fought in, but also of their ability to adapt, to survive. In the back of her mind, a question began to form, but she was hesitant to voice it. She wasn't sure if she was ready to trust Ethan that much. We need to keep moving, Ethan said, his eyes scanning the shadows once more. We're exposed here. The longer we stay in the open, the more likely it is that something worse could show up. Zyra nodded, forcing her mind to focus. The creature was gone for now, but there were many more dangers in this unknown forest. She had to keep her wits about her. Her thoughts drifted to the crash, the helpless feeling of being thrust into an alien world with no way to communicate, no way to contact her people. Her mission had gone completely awry, and now she had no idea if anyone was even looking for her. But there was no time to dwell on it. The sound of rushing water broke through her thoughts, and she looked up to see that the trees were thinning, revealing a small clearing ahead. In the center of the clearing was a river, its waters sparkling under the faint light of the bioluminescent flora around them. The current was strong, and the sound of the water crashing over the rocks in the riverbed was oddly calming. This way, Ethan said, his voice cutting through the air again, pulling her attention back to him. He was already moving toward the riverbank, stepping carefully as he approached the water's edge. We'll follow this downstream. We should be able to find some shelter, maybe some food. Zyra followed his lead, her heart still racing from the encounter with the creature, but she couldn't help but feel a strange sense of hope beginning to bloom. They were still alive. Against all odds, they were still alive. Maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end for her. Maybe she could survive this. As they made their way downstream, the landscape around them began to change. The forest was still thick, but now, the air smelled fresher, less stifling. The trees grew larger and more spaced out, the underbrush clearing to reveal patches of soft, mossy ground. The river wound its way through the valley, and in the distance, Zyra could make out what looked like large rock formations, perhaps even caves. Do you think anyone else is on this planet? Zyra asked quietly, her curiosity finally overcoming her caution. She glanced at Ethan, but his expression remained unreadable. Don't know, he replied, his eyes scanning the horizon. I've never been here before. It's uncharted, but we'll figure it out. He glanced at her, offering a small, reassuring smile. And if we're lucky, we might just find something useful. Maybe there's a way off this rock. Zyra felt a twinge of uncertainty. A way off? Would they even be able to find a way back to her people? She had no communication devices, no way to send a signal. If her ship had been completely destroyed, she might be stuck here for far longer than she had originally thought. But as they continued their trek, With the sound of the river growing louder in her ears, Zyra realized that for the first time in days, she felt a glimmer of something she hadn't expected to feel: hope. Despite the uncertainty of their situation, despite the dangers of the planet, she wasn't entirely alone. Ethan, this human she had once feared, had become her unlikely companion. Together, they might just stand a chance. Chapter 4: Unlikely Friends. The trek through the alien wilderness was slow but steady. The landscape around them shifted with every turn. At first, it had seemed as though every corner of the forest was impenetrable, filled with thick trees and undergrowth. But slowly the land began to open up, revealing a vast variety of strange flora and fauna that seemed to thrive in the dense atmosphere. Zyra couldn't help but be fascinated by the diversity she saw: the colorful flowers that glowed faintly, the trees whose bark seemed to pulse with energy, and the strange, ethereal creatures that darted from one hiding place to another, observing them with silent curiosity. Ethan had been quiet for the most part, always keeping a watchful eye on their surroundings. His posture was always alert, ready for anything. Zyra followed him closely, feeling safer in his presence, though there was still the nagging thought that, despite all his kindness, he was still a human, and humans had a long history of being unpredictable, often driven by self-interest. But she couldn't deny the fact that, in these moments of quiet, as they walked together, something unexpected was unfolding between them: an unspoken understanding, a bond born out of survival, necessity, and the strange circumstances that had brought them together. As they approached the riverbank, they found a small alcove between a cluster of large rocks, providing just enough cover for them to rest. The sun had begun to dip below the horizon, and the bioluminescent plants around them started to glow brighter, casting an eerie yet beautiful light across the landscape. Zyra sat down, leaning against the rocks, her eyes fixed on the river as she processed the events of the past few hours. Ethan sat beside her, his eyes scanning the environment with the calmness of someone used to surviving in unknown territory. For a moment, there was silence between them, the peaceful sound of the flowing river filling the air. "I don't know what we're going to do next," Zyra said, her voice soft but determined. "But we've survived this long. Maybe we can keep going, find a way to get back home." She glanced at Ethan, uncertainty lingering in her expression. I'm glad you're here." Ethan turned his head to look at her, his face softening for the first time since their encounter. "You're not alone, Zyra. We'll figure it out together. I don't know how, but I think we can." And for the first time since the crash, as she sat there beside the human, her fear subsiding for a moment, Zyra felt the strange sense of hope grow inside her. Maybe this wasn't the end after all. Maybe the universe had more in store for her than she had thought. The days following their encounter with the Predator were a blur of new discoveries and quiet camaraderie. Zyra and Ethan had managed to survive, against all odds, relying on each other in ways neither had expected. Their journey through the strange world, filled with peril at every turn, was marked by moments of exhaustion, fear, and fleeting moments of wonder as they encountered creatures and landscapes neither had imagined. Despite the dangers, there was a sense of solace in their companionship. In the midst of a wild and unforgiving world, they had found something unexpected: trust. As they continued to travel downstream, the two of them gradually began to learn more about one another. Ethan had been stranded on this planet for several years, having crash-landed after his own ship had malfunctioned. His survival skills were unmatched. He had learned to hunt, to adapt, to live off the land. The more Zyra listened to him, the more she realized how resourceful and resilient humans could be, despite the stories she had heard about their destructive tendencies. He was not the savage predator she had been warned about. Instead, he was a survivor, much like herself, driven by necessity and the desire to keep going, to never give up. And in return, Zyra shared her own knowledge, teaching Ethan about her world and the technology that powered her ship, even though it had long been rendered useless. The bond between them grew with each shared lesson, each new discovery. She came to understand that he was not so different from her. They were both travelers, both explorers in a world neither understood. They both faced dangers they hadn't anticipated, yet neither was willing to back down. Their journey eventually brought them to the edge of a vast mountain range. From there, they had a clear view of the planet's horizon, a sight that left them both breathless. The mountains stretched for miles, their snow-capped peaks touching the sky, a stark contrast to the dense forests they had navigated. But in the distance, beyond the peaks, Zyra could just make out the faint glimmer of what looked like a structure. A structure that was clearly artificial. That looks like a settlement, Zyra murmured, her heart beating faster as she squinted at the distant silhouette. Ethan followed her gaze, and his brow furrowed in concentration. Could be, he said. It could also be another of those alien ruins we saw earlier. But it's worth checking out. They wasted no time, quickly making their way toward the mountains, eager to uncover the truth behind the structure. The journey was long, and the terrain grew increasingly difficult as they ascended higher into the mountains. But with each step, Zyra felt a growing sense of purpose. It wasn't just the hope of finding shelter or a way off the planet. It was the idea that there might be more to this world than just the unknown dangers they had faced. Perhaps there were answers here, answers that could change everything. As they approached the settlement, the structure became clearer, a series of stone and metal buildings tucked into the side of the mountainside. It was unlike anything Zyra had seen before. The architecture was advanced, but it bore none of the markings of her own people or the technology she was familiar with. It was ancient, yet seemed well preserved, as though the civilization that built it had once thrived but had long since vanished. They approached cautiously, knowing that they could not be sure what or who was waiting for them. But as they stepped closer, the door to the largest building slowly creaked open, revealing a figure standing in the shadow of the doorway. It was another alien, but this one was nothing like the predators they had encountered. It was small, delicate, its translucent skin shimmering in the light. It was humanoid in shape, but its features were soft and graceful, its eyes wide and glowing faintly. It watched them with interest, not fear or hostility, but curiosity. "Hello," the alien said, its voice melodic and serene. "I have been waiting for you." Zyra and Ethan exchanged a glance, both of them stunned. The alien continued, stepping forward into the light. "You are not the first to come here," the alien explained. "But you are the first to survive the trials of this world." The small alien looked at both of them, its expression warm and welcoming. It wasn't a threat, it wasn't an enemy. It was a part of this planet, a living remnant of a forgotten civilization. "I am Rael," the alien continued. "And you, travelers, have unlocked the key to this world's legacy. You have proven that there is still hope, still a future beyond the darkness." Zyra's heart raced as the weight of the alien's words sank in. She and Ethan had unknowingly uncovered something far greater than survival. They had uncovered the possibility of a new beginning. This planet, once abandoned and forgotten, now held the answers to mysteries that had remained hidden for centuries. And together, they had found a way to unlock it. Rael stepped aside, gesturing for them to enter the settlement. "Come," it said. "The knowledge of this world is waiting for you." With a final, shared glance, Zyra and Ethan entered the structure. The door closed behind them, and the future, once so uncertain, now seemed full of possibilities. Together, they had not only survived but had found something more. A connection, an understanding, and the possibility of discovering the secrets that lay within this forgotten world. In the quiet that followed, Zyra found herself smiling, the once constant fear that had filled her chest now replaced by something different, a sense of belonging, of hope, and of something even more unexpected than she had ever imagined. Fate, it seemed, had other plans. And with the human at her side, Zyra knew that whatever those plans were, she was ready to face them. Together, they would discover what lay beyond the horizon, what secrets the world held, and whether the bond they had forged would be enough to uncover the mysteries of this alien planet and perhaps find a way back home. And so, the story of their journey continued, not as adversaries, but as partners too, unlikely allies, bound by fate, ready to face whatever came next. The future was still uncertain, but it was theirs to shape. Together,